Madam Speaker, I will not rescue your morning, but Pepto-Bismol, Gatorade, and Saltines will. I recommend that after this round. Madam Speaker, what we're going to give you here today is we're going to talk about monogamy, and the first claim that we want to make is that sexuality and gender are inextricably linked. There's no way that you can construct relationships between human beings that are sexual or romantic in nature that do not have strong implications of their gender, both within that relationship and without. So first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the historical institution of monogamy, why it's important, how we've codified it, why it actually happened in the first place, and then I'm going to give you 3 reasons why we think this is incredibly damaging to gender emancipation, liberation, or whatever word you want to use. Okay, let's talk about this historical institution. Because the historical institution was primarily codified through marriage. But the impetus to do so was to create an exclusive property contract, more or less, for 2 people over each other. In practice, in patriarchal societies, this meant that men had an exclusive claim to the property rights of women. Because, at this time, the sense in which they interacted was more or less an economic unit to perpetuate families and to perpetuate societies. Moreover, it allowed men to control their seed and their lineage in an exclusive way over women because there's no ambiguity over like whose child the woman's is. Therefore, you need a marriage contract to force them into it in order to ensure that you can continue your seed. Basically, it's all about setting up exclusive zones of domination over other human beings. Weirdly enough, the only thing throughout history, and to this day in many even quote-unquote developed westernized countries, the only way to negate these contracts for the most part has been adultery, i.e. breaking the exclusivity of that contract. Not actually not loving each other, not getting along, etc. It's been very difficult to introduce these norms into the idea of monogamy, because the idea of monogamy is premised on exclusivity, not on love. Okay, let's talk about, and by the way, these social norms are all pervasive. In every form of popular media, marriage is like lionized as something that we should all aspire to. Women, as they're growing up, are told that they need to find a nice man, and they look forward to their wedding day. We see this in soap operas, we see this in bad sitcoms, we see that this is the virtuous end of Shakespearean comedies even, and in multiple marriages, and that's the way that the story resolves itself. That's where we all want to end up. There are 3 problems with this. First of all, we think this entrenches any power disparities that already exist, and that social norms are so coercive that you could not make a free choice about it. We say that secondly, it requires an internalization of ideas of gender that come from a binary exclusive relationship in the traditional heteronormative mold. And third of all, we're going to say that it massively restricts sexual behaviors of people who are outside of marriages, i.e. people who are not in these monogamous relationships. Okay, let's talk about this power dynamics that exist. When there are differences in power between 2 people who are in a particular exclusive relationship and have exclusive domain over each other, the internal dynamics of that relationship are responsive to broad social pressures. The broad social pressures that allow men to make more money on the dollar for the exact same types of work than women, the exact same social pressures that allow them more political agency, I'll take you in a second, are the exact same things that are reflected internally within that relationship, not just in terms of their literal interactions, but in terms of what they're expected to do. What they're expected to do, therefore, creates a role of a superior and an inferior role in their overall social advocacy and their ability to move above. Go ahead, though.
Just for clarity, do you believe that even in context of monogamy, that women can assert themselves if they're economically emancipated, and that is a shift in power dynamic in the framework of monogamy?
So I think that we're missing the point here in this debate is not to say that monogamy never works for anyone. It's not something that's hardwired into human biology necessarily. I think that like our animalistic instincts are to go spread our seed, but we say that there's a lot of times when people fall in love and say, you know what, I'm willing to suppress that like id part of myself in the behalf of true love. We think that happens on our side of the house without a social norm. When you find somebody that you're saying, I actually want to give up the right to sleep with other people, to have romantic entanglements with other people. What you're saying is that when you have a strong social norm that is codified in law and given economic and like social status, we say that those people aren't choosing freely to enter into that kind of relationship. Not yet. Okay. So the no social norm, so basically what we're saying is that it perpetuates these divides, perpetuates these dynamics within relationships, which then has the impact of appropriating them. The second point, and this is really, I think, the killer point in this round, is it requires an internalization of ideas of gender that can only be defined when you have an exclusive, binary, heterosexual relationship. So we say that for people who are either have a multiplicity of sexuality, be they bisexual, be they queer, or if they have a multiplicity or a difference of gender identity that is not either male or female, it is very difficult for them to express that gender or that sexuality when it's referenced to just one other person. Because we say that if, for example, a bisexual person is in a relationship, a heterosexual relationship, it does not allow them to define their bisexuality within the terms of that monogamous relationship, and therefore they have to suppress and subsume that identity in favor of the heterosexuality that they're currently engaged in. Why is this a problem? We think that there are going to be times that bisexual people fall in love with a person of the opposite sex, and that's the lifestyle they choose to live. But when they face immense social pressure and political and legal pressure and economic pressure in order to enter into these units, we say that therefore it denies their capacity to have other identities. We say this is particularly damaging in terms of gender identities because we think that minority gender identities can be defined in terms of reference to multiple different sides of the gender spectrum. That's not possible when you have only one other person in a relationship. We think that these kind of non-traditional identities require a level of non-monogamy and non-exclusivity. But go ahead.
Given your potential world where monogamy doesn't exist, what do you have to show us that prevents another system of potentially patriarchal dominance, like a polygamous form that is exploitative, of stepping into the vacuum?
Right. We think that polygamy, as it's currently practiced, is more or less an expression of monogamy gone particularly bad, which is to say that it's a series of exclusive relationships on one side of the spectrum and non-exclusive relationships on the other side of the spectrum. Men get exclusive domain over women, not vice versa. Therefore, what we say is we need to explode this entire notion that there ever could be an exclusive claim on another person that is in some way coerced. We therefore need to move beyond that entirely. But the last thing I want to talk about is not these monogamous relationships at all, not these marriage type relationships at all, that exist in societies that have as a norm for monogamy. Because we know that they exist. We know that hookup culture exists. We know there's sex outside of marriage, or at least, like you might have heard of it on TV. Okay, so yeah, Monica agrees with me. The problem with these relationships is we shame them as being inferior to the committed monogamous relationships that exist over long periods of time. When we have patriarchal societies, however, we, for the most part, shame the people who are women or the gender identities that are in the minorities who engage in this behavior. That's why there's this pervasive stereotype of gay men being particularly promiscuous. That's why there's this pervasive stereotype that women who sleep around are sluts, and these kind of senses of otherwise shame and condemnation. What we say is it's only possible for them to shame those types of behavior, which are perfectly natural and might even be beneficial to those people, if we have a counterfactual that is valued by society higher. We reject that, that's why we refuse.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his charming bit of slut-shaming in the morning. I'd now like to invite the Leader of the Opposition to introduce the case for side-off today. Here, here. I'm just teasing you.
Okay.
Hey, he doesn't understand that very well.
Madam Speaker, first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit or a lot of rebuttal to what you just heard here and the way we understand the status quo and why we don't share the problematics and the dynamics explained by the Prime Minister. And then I basically have 2 points that I would like to bring into the debate. First of all, I'm going to talk about why it's a fallacy to think that only one model is prevalent in numbers that equals oppressing of other models. And secondly, I'm going to talk about how we think that, gender empowerment for both women and people that are not according to the normative or prevalent sexual orientation pattern, namely being homosexual or varieties of that, are still possible without having to abandon, monogamy as seen here by the first government. So let's start with rebuttal first. Now we think there is a fallacy in argumentation when you say the way it has been in the past, forever, was problematic, and that's why it will be problematic in the future. Because we think the thing that has been described by the Prime Minister, we agree very much with, that this historical idea of monogamy came with the idea of marriage and the man owning the woman, basically, or a huge imbalance in hierarchy in rights and power. But we see that today that is changing. Couples can still be monogamous, they still can be heterosexual, but they are equal in power and hierarchy. We see this especially, it's not prevalent in the society, it's not the dominant type of relationship, but it is starting to change. And the thing that is changing that is not abolishing monogamy, but educating women and empowering women so they can go to work, they're educated, they have rights, and they have like dominance and the power over their own lives. And when they look for a boyfriend and a husband, they're looking for someone that is ready to accept them and them in their powerful position and share responsibilities and not make them the mother and make them stay at home. So relationships we see at the moment, and like there are not many, but like in educated circles where you have both of them being highly educated, both of them being emancipated, and both of them acknowledging that both have to be equal and take equal responsibility in the household and in child rearing and all that, is where we have a monogamous relationship where both are empowered and we don't have the problems of hierarchy and ownership and suppression that was pointed out by the Prime Minister. All that has been made to go away, not by abolishing monogamy, but changing the way that women can function in society and empowering women. We think that is something that works, that is something that is more desirable than imposing another dominant pattern that then suppresses people that like to be monogamous. And that's why we think this is a rather better way to go about it and emancipate minorities of the past than to just, change one thing that you think is the main reason for that. Now, lastly on that is, this idea is, you didn't really show us, like you say, we have like one dominant pattern of relationships that has been suppressive in the past. We want to change that with another one. We want this one to be the dominant, but you don't explain us why you're not actually exchanging one suppressive model for another one. Because what happens to the people that actually really like monogamy, that actually maybe like to have a relationship that is not 100% equal, or it looks like that because a woman accepts traditional roles but does that out of her free will. Something that many people cannot believe is actually true. But if you take respect for emancipation and a woman's right to absolutely choose when she's fully informed and educated, you have to also accept her decision, even if it looks traditional and suppressive, when she makes that decision out of her free will, and that balances pros and cons and does that decision. So we think you're not really making anything better, you're just exchanging one bad thing with another bad thing if it becomes, again, dominant and suppressive. So let's talk about the first thing. Before I go on, yeah, please.
Okay, so these kind of non-exclusive relationships or exclusive relationships are going to exist on either side of the house. Which one should we encourage people to seek? The ones that trap people into particular relationships that they have an intimate dynamic, or ones that are more open?
We think it doesn't matter. The thing that we should be promoting is that both members of a relationship, regardless of their gender, regardless of how they live the relationship, open or closed, monogamous or not, are both equal. And we don't see that you've proven to us that there is something specific to monogamy, even today, where we have education, where we have empowerment, where we have this emancipation and progress in society for women and LGBT members, that still exists in monogamy. Because all those people can still choose to be monogamous and can still have an equal relationship. There is nothing to, consensually choosing to be exclusive in a relationship that automatically suppresses one part just by that part out of free will consenting to that kind of relationship. This is something that you don't manage to explain, and it's, I think, also very hard for you to explain because it's not true. So let's talk about this idea that you can make the mistake you're making about only because it might be prevalent in numbers, because I agree it is probably the dominant model, meaning that most people in all our societies go for a monogamous relationship. It doesn't mean that only because in the past it has been oppressive and that people that don't live this type of relationship have been discriminated against, that first of all, it will continue to be like that, and it is contingent upon the characteristic of being monogamous. Because we see that our societies are evolving towards being more progressive and being more tolerant. That we all say, you might live a model that I don't even like, I would not do it myself, but I acknowledge the greater principle of tolerance. And I see that you're not doing active harm to me or to anyone else. You're a functioning member of the society. You're working, maybe you're a doctor, you're a teacher, you're good at your work. I don't really appreciate your private life, but I appreciate the principle of tolerance. And we see that many societies where you have one majority in numbers can still have tolerance and respect for a minority. We see all of this happening in societies where we have immigrants, where we have ethnic minorities that are respected and left alone for living a different type of life than the dominant society in numbers. So they are dominant in numbers, but it doesn't mean that they will continue like it has been in the past, we agree, but that is definitely changing, and changing even more right now, that it's going to continue to be like that. So we see that a change to the better is possible and already happening under the status quo because the principle of tolerance and acceptance has become more prevalent than, you thinking you have a right to impose your way of life on someone else when it's actually not hurting you. And we see that, society today has also, this is basically my last point, become much more individualized. So you can be happy even if you don't live what is the prevalent or dominant model, because there is more and more no dominant model. We have conservative gay people, we have liberal gay people, we have conservative people that don't marry, but just, don't like stay on their own, and so on and so forth. So we have an individualization of the society and ways of living your life, which makes it easier for people with different types of lives to still be accepted, and for all those reasons we beg you to oppose.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition for her speech. I'd now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the first proposition case today. Here. Blah.
Firstly, let me talk about social norms. I'm going to speak generally what social norms mean. There are pervasive ideas that point to correctness or what the right thing is that speaks to a majority of people. Right? In the past, historically, monogamy has been established as the social norm because there was a deep connection between monogamy, which means exclusivity in relationships, and therefore that equates to love. That's the historical analysis that Colin gave you. I think the only just order of a social norm that we should impose upon relationships is relationships that are based upon love, and that's it. That doesn't mean we need to replace this with completely inexclusive relationships. This doesn't mean we're the side of adultery. I would literally not want to speak if that were the case. I think that we can still have monogamous relationships on our side of the house. We just dispute the fact that it needs to be a social norm because that its existence as a social norm prevents any type of meaningful dissent and actually results in certain things like slut shaming that Colin talked to you about that weren't meaningfully challenged by the opening opposition. But what do we get specifically, right? She says that because people have been persecuted in the past because of our historical analysis, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will be in the future, right? Our historical analysis actually relies on biological evidence about just the fact that men can't see their children coming out from them. And furthermore, we're speaking about not just a theoretical society in which gender emancipation is happening, we're talking about a society that must come from this particular society in which gender emancipation is happening. Furthermore, when she points to things that are becoming better on their side of the house in the status quo, we think that this is probably because monogamy is being abandoned as a social norm. We're eroding the idea that monogamy is necessary for positive, exclusive, love-based relationships. We think that all of the points of positive progress that you see between well-educated people that choose to be monogamous, we are absolutely 100% okay with. We just dispute that all relationships should be classified as normal and normalized in this particular way. Yes?
Do you believe that just by social interaction we create social norms in any case? The best source of gender emancipation is working within a context of social norms when you can never eradicate them.
Absolutely. And I don't think those social norms should ever be exclusivity or inexclusivity. They should never speak to how many people you sleep with. It should only speak to, number one, your consent regarding the person that you're sleeping with, and number two, the fact that you are engaging in some expression of love or happiness in those particular relationships. I think that if we abandon the idea of exclusivity or inclusivity at all with any prefix or suffix, it's important to not categorize relationships on love on that particular way. So we're not abandoning all social norms. I think our analysis is a lot more nuanced. We're saying that different social norms are a lot better. Secondly, she talks about majority in numbers. I don't think majority in numbers is sufficient to create a pervasive social norm. So theoretically, if there were a society where most people were non-monogamous, monogamy could still be a social norm if it was a pervasive structure that was imposed upon people, telling them the proper way to engage in a relationship. This is what Colin tells you when it says it entrenches power disparities because the idea of exclusivity inherently creates expectations which perpetuates certain dynamics that have biological bases. We don't think that monogamy necessarily means love, even though it might in some instances. We think that individuals should be able to freely define what they understand as loving, productive relationships to themselves based upon their own gender, their own identity, and their own conception of what is good. And we think that pervasive social norms that speak to particular exclusivity fly in the face of other types of relationships that don't want to necessarily be exclusive. So the question that I have for you is if you think that a person that is gender emancipated or people that are gender emancipated can engage in a productive relationship that is not exclusive, we should reject this as a social norm because social norms inherently push people towards certain ideas because they're coercive in some way. Which means that we're okay with certain social norms being like pushing people towards the idea of consent and pushing people towards the idea of liberation and pushing people towards the idea of emancipation and love, but we're not okay with social norms that push people towards the idea of exclusivity for the reason that Colin gives you. No, thank you. Right? And what are those particular reasons? Number one, they entrench power disparities. I've already talked about this because they're exclusive zones of domination that are the bases for exclusivity. There are ways for people to dominate other people. We don't think this can ever be in a way that's that is emancipated. She says that we're imposing another dominant pattern. I don't think that we necessarily are, other than social norms that I've already talked about that are based upon love, free acceptance, and consent, which we think are a lot better. Secondly, Colin tells you that this internalizes gender norms. There's an exclusive binary and a reference to another person in which your identity is inherently created. Right? We think that this might be the case for some people, but its entrenchment as a social norm pushes people, especially when they're very young, to seek out exclusive relationships as the way these things are particularly done and the way these things are beneficial. Its existence as a social norm inherently creates a hierarchy of superiority, which is Colin's third argument that I'm going to cash out a little bit more right now. Right? So because it's a social norm, because it's so pervasive, it shames other ideas of what relationships could be as being inferior, as being not as good, because they don't conform to the dominant heteronormative or heterogeneous style of relationships that most people agree with. I'll take a POA from the opening. I got you guys earlier.
Don't you think that social norms sometimes happen to make you happier?
Yeah, I think I've been relatively clear about the idea that I'm not rejecting all social norms whatsoever. That would be rather absurd. But we think that the social norms should not be speaking specifically to exclusivity or inclusivity. I think I've been abundantly clear about this. Everybody understands it, right? So, a social norm of exclusivity shames other norms as being inferior, which means that people who are sexually promiscuous are inherently the other, they're otherized, and they're put as less than, which leads to things like the dominant social norm that is heterogeneous and heteronormative condemning other forms of identity, which means it's a lot less easy for people to engage in these types of productive expressions of their identity if they happen to want to be promiscuous. I think that the fact that promiscuous has a hanging negative connotation is a bad thing, and it exists because monogamy is a pervasive social norm, because monogamy is seen as a good relationship because you're exclusive and you can control your animalistic id, and we don't think you should do that. We think emancipation is engaging the type of free expression, the free love that you wish to engage in, whether it be monogamous or promiscuous, it doesn't matter. So the existence of one as a social norm regarding exclusivity, if you think that promiscuity is a positive way to interact with other people or a positive gender identity that someone could hold, is incredibly problematic. Furthermore, we think that they're specifically targeted against women and other sexual communities, namely homosexuals or the LGBT community, because of the history of domination, which is why Colin's historical analysis is incredibly important for determining the ways in which societies are going to exist in the future. Because regardless of how progressive our societies become, they always exist with some type of eye toward the past. There is a historical, biological basis for these types of domination that we think that we should necessarily reject. So what have I told you at the end of the day? I've told you that monogamy doesn't necessarily equal love, and I think that love can engage in that positive love-based relationships can exist regardless of whether you're promiscuous or regardless of whether you're monogamous. The existence of one as a social norm condemns the other, makes it the other. Even if it's a happily accepted other, it's still an alternate. We don't think it should be an alternate. We think that all relationships should be held relatively equally, and because we think this, we're very, very proud.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister very much for his speech. I'd now like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to conclude the front half of the debate for us today. Here.
I'm pretty sure that opening government did not understand the problem with adultery. It's not actually that you sleep with someone else. It's more the idea that this sleeping with someone else manifests that there is a lack of love and trust in the relationship. And this is the problem. It's not the problem that you slept with someone and had physical exchange. The problem is that you actually were acting against the trust in the relationship. And we believe that this trust might be sometimes good and might usually be a good thing if you agree to it, it's consensual and with free knowledge. But if you didn't agree in the first place, that might be fine as well. We think that you're right, we should debate in reality, and we should actually talk about societies that are existent, and where we are pretty close to full gender emancipation, and where we think that still we have a monogamous norm as the prevalent norm. Actually, I like Dutch women. I personally believe that they are, the idea that they are emancipated. They do what they want, and in relationships they are usually equal. This is because from the 15th century on, women there were to choose who they want to marry. They were not forced to do it. So the idea that your historical analysis means that it will always be like that in the future is simply not true. Maybe it needs more 100 years, maybe it needs 200 years more, but this doesn't mean that it requires the abandonment of monogamy to have full gender emancipation. The idea there is that just because in America you have your fluffy pink idea of womanhood, that doesn't mean that it needs to be like that all the time and every time. And just because in television you see this happy ever after forever, doesn't mean it will be like this forever. Because if you see the development from the 60s to the 80s to the 90s, then I'm pretty sure if we go farther that way, until 2050, till 21, we believe that there will happen good things for women and that there can be actually equal things. So, now your point was slut shaming. In Berlin, we are a little bit above that stuff here. We don't. No, the idea is in capitals, in certain cities, you have the idea that it is okay to sleep with whomever you want. Just do it. Just don't promise someone else that you won't. And this is the difference there. We don't have a problem with adultery and the idea that you have a monogamous relationship. We think that for most people at a certain age, it is a good thing to have stability. And lots of people want that. That's why it is a dominant form. But we don't believe that it is a problem if you do whatever you want. If you're gay and you want to sleep with lots of men, that's fine with us. But this doesn't mean that lots of people at a certain age probably, or at a certain phase, or if they found the right person, are not able to promise something else. They still can accept the other things. I still can accept my gay friend who sleeps with a lot of women if I'm in a monogamous relationship. And this is possible because I started to understand other people. That's just empathy and talking to them. And this is possible, to understand other views even though if I have another concept of living. And developed societies actually evolve that. The idea that other people might be right as well. Closing.
So isn't there this kind of funny thing called biology that means women need to settle down a heck of a lot earlier than men do? Don't we think that's a little unfair?
No. We firstly think that is a problem that might be solvable over time, so we see the extension of age for women getting children later. We still think that this is a problem that where we say that everybody can do this on his own. Everybody has the possibility to choose whenever or whatever he wants to trust someone. There might be the idea that I have to exchange my freedom for security. This is what we call marriage in that case, or monogamy in another case. That I exchange certain degrees to freedom for stability. And there we have the possibility to actually have a happy life and a stable life. And if you're saying that there is an inherent imbalance, then I think you misunderstand why you make this John Locke is odd fallacy. Just because it is like this doesn't mean it ought to be like this and will be like this. If we just want to change it strongly enough. I'm not quite sure what's so happy about it actually. I think this is a serious question. It's the question of how we can live together in partial relationship in the future and have a stable relationship and still accept other people. So, my last point is the idea of how does society actually work and what is society today. It is this debating society. The people in debating think always there's this large society. In reality, this doesn't really exist. You have different circles. You have different circles you're living in. You have your friends, maybe your working friends, you have your private friends, but when was actually the last time you were speaking with someone who was for 10 years unemployed? Just be honest. How often does it happen that you engage with people in other circles than yourself? If you're religious, then it might happen that you from time to time talk to a liberal, but this is not your predominant circle. We believe there are those different circles, and we have we think that in each of them you can find yourself. If you are gay and you want to have another norm, then you can live in your circle easily. Without that, actually, the other circles judge you. It's still okay to be that way, and we think political correctness is enough that it's actually harmful for you to say this relationship is not fine, because then you are a homophobe. And being a homophobe right now is, in accordance to our political correctness, one of the worst badges that you can have. Therefore, we believe that those circles can exist next to each other, so that we have maybe in total number a predominant monogamous social norm, but this doesn't mean that other circles don't exist where you can be gay and that I like to talk to you. Actually, it makes you more interesting if you're gay and sleep with a lot of people and you have the possibility to tell me what your way of living is. This actually makes you more interesting. It doesn't make you inferior because we accept it as a way of living. Your question.
So let's say about people who are bisexual or genderqueer. We focus exclusive relationships, we talk about promiscuity. What about 3 or 4 people living together for long periods of time and that type of non-traditional relationship? What about that middle ground?
There's the question, can I accept it, even if there is a dominant norm? We say, I can still accept it, and I have no problem with it. I don't judge it as inferior to mine, but in my circle, this one is the dominant one. If you like to have this life, we are fine with that. We think that is an expression of your sexuality or whatever you like. We are fine with all that. We just don't believe that it is necessary that I therefore make you an inferior person or don't give you the same rights in society. We don't buy it. Why don't we buy it? Because we saw in the history that actually the more we talked to other people, the more we understood other people, the more we were accepting them gradually. For all minorities and all things that we didn't understand, it evolved actually always in the right direction. When it comes to the gay rights movement, when it comes to the rights of women in marriage. 40 years ago, it was totally reasonable for me to beat my wife and actually sleep with her if she didn't want that. But we evolved that. All those things are possible. We have this development. Right now it is considered rape and I go to prison for the same thing. We see this evolvement in the gay rights movement as well. 20 years ago it was not possible that you think of this as the same thing. Now it is. Now you are a bad guy if you are a homophobe. And we believe that this development we can see everywhere. And because we can see it everywhere, we believe that it is not necessary that one predominant...
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader for his speech. I'd now like to invite the member of the government to introduce the case beside second proposition today. Here.
Just before I start, ain't no way in hell this one's going online. Okay.
Is that because you're gonna have a bad score?
Because I'm gonna use lots of bad words.
Exciting.
Alright.
I actually give auto losses for swearing.
That doesn't happen in round 1.
No, it's not.
Thanks very much, Madam Speaker. So I'm going to talk about modern constraints on women and how we actually stop these modern constraints, and how the only way to do this is by actually allowing them to fully explore sexuality, how that's not going to happen until we end monogamy, all the reasons it's the case. First, I'm going to talk about like dominant social tropes, why these matter, and then why people are sexually and like better off and more stable when they actually engage in these other types of relationships, and at very least aren't dominated by a norm that subjects them to one particular type of relationship, and why that can be particularly pernicious. All right. So what are the social tropes that currently dominate society? Because I think what's an interesting characterization that's been missing from the round so far is the actual dichotomy that women and men face right now. Because while yes, monogamy is a dominant thing that most people at some point or another buy into, realize that A, the times at which this happens are significantly different, and B, that the extent to which they buy into these is also significantly different. Women are told through movies, through culture, through their parents, through everything, that they are supposed to buy into love, right? Like, think about The Notebook, The Princess Diaries. What do we talk about in the movies that we watch, right? It's all about man and wife and prince and princess being saved, right? These are the tropes that are pushed on women at a young age. These tropes are not mirrored when you talk about men, right? They watch The Hangover, they watch Ted, they watch all of these other sexually explicit movies that tell them that it's cool to be like out screwing lots of women, right? That isn't what women are told. This dichotomy means that one half of the population is broadly often looking for relationships, while the other side isn't interested in them. You actively disadvantage the group that is being constrained by these norms, because recognize that those constraints are significantly harsher on women, because they are literally being enculturated from every aspect of their lives and communities to engage in this paradigm, whereas men in no way feel those same types of pressures because they simply aren't indoctrinated in the same type of ways. So why does this actually matter? I think that opening told us about the history that this comes from, but I also think it's important to consider like part of the biological basis here, which is what I tried to POI into first half, right? Realize that women are at a disadvantage in that like we only have a certain number of childbearing years, whereas men can procreate until they die, right? Insofar as this is the case, even if this sort of balancing effect that opening opposition tries to tell you about does at some age occur, it certainly disadvantages women in terms of careers, in terms of having children, in terms of building stable relationships and lives, because it means that we have to commit to these things at a younger age. So what do Brent and I see society actually looking like when we stop accepting these types of norms and stop pushing people into these early monogamous relationships? A, I think you advantage women by encouraging them to explore different types of options. I don't think that you necessarily need to raise the child like the only person that you will ever sleep with for the rest of your life, right? I think that you can buy into certain constructs that are A, not conventional, right? You can actually have meaningful relationships that accomplish different things within your life, right? You can raise a child perhaps with another woman and engage in an emotionally fulfilling relationship with them, while engaging also in sexually involved relationships with lots of other people. I think those are things that are not necessarily need to be tied, right? These are mutually exclusive parts of your life that can be divided in many ways. And it's important to consider that by dividing them, we actually advantage women, or at very least by rejecting the norm that ties them together. Because if we accept the norm that ties them together, we make it easier for men to continue to perpetuate these types of cultural norms that push us into a scenario where women are being disadvantaged. Yeah.
So, in the context of social interaction, it's exactly the spectrum that they talked about which would be disadvantaged. It's because you create a new dominant paradigm where you have to work in a framework of social norms.
So when we talk about fluid relationships and different relationships that fill different types of roles in your life, it doesn't become some new type of norm where you have to have one wife to raise your children with and one husband then to have sex with. Those are not what we're talking about. We're talking about the types of relationships that create this type of fluidity and that reject these dominant structures that I've already talked to you about. I don't think that you suddenly create a new type of norm. You just create lots of other options for different types of norms. And it's up to you to embrace whichever one it is that you see fit, and whatever one you think can best help you self-actualize and all of those good words. Okay, so why is it that women actually need to take these types of relationships into their own hands, that we have the opportunity to do so? I think that first of all, that sexuality is broadly irrational. And that we are attracted to someone, you want to have sex with them, and therefore you engage in those acts and do so, right? I think that lots of other relationships within our lives are not based on the same type of irrational principle. I think that people often make choices based on marriages and long-term partnerships that are more important, right? You make more important calculuses in your life than actually what's going to give you the most sexual fulfillment. I think those are equally important choices, but they are choices that ought not be pushed into a dichotomy, because you should allow women to be able to decide which one of those ones they would actually like to get from which person. And until we reject the social norm that tells women through all of these things, like the movies that I tell you about, that they have to be in this category where it's one man and one wife, you encourage men to continue to allow these, to have these fluid relationships to a greater extent than you allow women to have, which will continue to disadvantage them. No. Okay. So how does this all play into the idea of gender, sexuality, and whatnot? So I think that since the time of Alfred Kinsey, we've known that all women can orgasm and all women can enjoy sex. So why is it that women haven't actually been able to exercise this sexuality to the same extent that men have under the status quo? I think it's very simple. That a woman is told that she is to love her husband and raise her children at 25. That a man has until 40 to be able to extend, whatever age, but a man has the opportunity to be able to extend this far past that. I think the status quo are unfairly being burdened with the types of realities that create these gender norms. When we have more women in leadership positions, when we have more women being able to exercise their sexuality and have them being able to engage on a more equal playing field through having different types of relationships from different types of people, you give them the opportunity to be equal. That is what true equality looks like, unlike what opening opposition would tell you is what we actually have now. I think that's just patently false. Okay, so quickly some refutation. I think a lot of it was implicit. So basically this idea that you're going to be pressuring women into an open relationship, I think that is just obviously patently false, right? That by opening this type of reality to people, you are rejecting something that is a long-standing historical construct. You are not pushing them into a new construct. You are allowing them the opportunity to explore whatever it is that they want. I think in and of itself, this movement is about exploring what you want. It is not about tying yourself down to any particular thing. I think that's at the core of what we're talking about. The next thing that they tell us is that you can have tolerance for a minority, but still have it as a minority. But I think the problem here is that it's entrenched in your upbringing, and it's entrenched in media, and it's entrenched in actual biology, right? And insofar as that's the case, it makes it really, really hard to overcome it without eliminating it as a social norm. You have to create a paradigm whereby people can reject that norm so that they can actually engage in all the things that opposition tell you are so good. The last thing that quickly I want to talk about is this idea of them saying, listen, we're fine with young people having sex, and we're fine with people enjoying that while they're young, but then we think it's probably a good idea for you to settle down and get married, and we think these constructs are important. Listen, I think that this is exactly at the crux of what Brett and I are standing on today, right? Is that women are disproportionately disadvantaged when we force people into constructs that bind them to these types of monogamous relationships that mean they need one thing from one man who has been enculturated to believe that he doesn't want the same thing from you at the same age. We are very proud of this.
I'd like to thank the member of the government for rubbing my spinsterhood in my face. And anytime, champ.
How old are you?
I'm 42.
That means you are male and fertile.
I already have 17 illegitimate kids, don't worry about it. Whenever you're ready.
Eric's just gonna be
Eric's gonna be,
Like
hi
watching that
Eric,
video.
he's gonna be so pissed that I
And now we're talking about how Eric's gonna be so
I said hi Eric. He knows this.
Hi Eric.
Good 42.
I look pretty good for 42.
Madam Chair, this debate is a fundamental question about whether or not we have to eliminate monogamy if we want meaningful gender emancipation. It's a debate about whether or not we have to get rid of this if we want true equality. All we have heard from the entire government bench is a rant about people suffering and being oppressed, which is a genuine rant. People do suffer and have been awfully oppressed. And then simply a rant against societal norms. But what they've failed to show us is how we could live in a paradigm where dominant societal norms do not exist. What they have failed to acknowledge is that all that they have apparently offered us that is intrinsic damage of monogamy is actually just the consequence of having a dominant societal norm. What we heard from side opening government was the fact that there are power dominance issues potentially. The fact that ideas of gender are internalized and forced to be spread. The fact that some people are othered. Madam Chair, that would happen in any sort of societally dominant context. That is not intrinsic to monogamy. That is not intrinsic to any sort of no, you are not, but no thank you. And so what I'm going to be showing you in terms of my extension is that given the fact that it is impossible to escape dominant societal norms, it is fully possible for women and other historically disadvantaged communities to achieve meaningful gender emancipation within the context of any dominant societal norm, including monogamy. Most of my rebuttal is going to be integrated because it clashes very directly with what we've heard down the entire side from government. So let's get into some sort of analysis of this. And you've heard a headline of this in the POI that Yash offered to opening government. So what they have ignored is the fact that we just fundamentally from opposition don't understand what a society would look like that doesn't have dominant societal norms. When human beings interact, when human beings engage with each other, human beings form preferences that sometimes aggregate and become dominant across large groups of people. That necessarily creates societal norms that then influence and mold people and take on positions of influencing their identities and changing their identities and how they live. Opening government and indeed closing government tried to paint a picture in which we could escape this world. We don't see this as possible given the way that humans interact and societal, I'll take opening in a second, and societal positions always develop. The fact that it is impossible to free ourselves from this context means that what we need to do from closing up is show that meaningful gender emancipation can happen all in this context. Ironically, from opening and indeed closing government, they said we want to be anti all societal norms and we basically want to be anti prescribing people's best worldviews, but then we're prescriptive about what good relationships are. Opening government told us what a best relationship would be within a context of apparently allowing people meaningful choice and railing against things that are oppressive. We find this contradictory and absurd, and that was followed by the sort of nebulous, fluid idea of perfect relationships, a very 1960s hippie ideal from closing government.
So we actually really like social norms at our side of the house. We're just saying that exclusivity and love should be divorced. In fact, your opening team said that those two concepts are inextricably linked. For these gender sub-communities that are non-traditional, is it even possible for them to form relationships of exclusivity with one other person?
What we're saying is that whenever there's a dominant social norm, you form exclusivity about dominance, you form othering between groups of people. What we are also saying is that it is frankly absurd for opening government to tell us that we need some sort of fluidity and absence of monogamous oppression and then prescribe the best sort of relationships to other people. We reject this. We don't think this is acceptable. So now that I've shown you that you can't dispel, that you can't just simply dispel gender norms, let's talk a little bit about how we think it is meaningfully possible for people to actually have meaningful gender emancipation within a context of perpetual and always existing societal norms that are necessitated through the ways that human beings interact with each other. So how do we think that this can meaningfully occur? Not right now, man, maybe in a minute or so. Okay, So what we need to acknowledge is the fact that as much as meaningful emancipation in terms of this debate was defined in terms of laws and practices, we take a very a more deeper sense of freedom and emancipation approach to this. We think that laws and practices are the means to an end of meaningful emancipation for people in a given context, right? So we think that laws and practices and good societal treatment are meaningful insofar as they allow people to create the lives that they ideally and best want to live, right? That's why human rights that are prescribed to people are negative rights, because the point is they govern the spaces between people that then allow them to create lives that are best meaningful and most meaningful for themselves. So and I'll take you in a second, man, why do we think that it is possible in this context for people to create this meaningful life? Because it is readily and easily able to, conceptualize, and it is apparent that people can get meaning and fulfill meaning within monogamous relationships. The fact that women can just simply choose that they want a traditional lifestyle. The fact that they can form their own conceptions of womanhood within a context of monogamy. And there's nothing specific to monogamy that we have heard from the government bench to show us that this is not the case. This was their burden in the debate, to show us that monogamy was an obstacle to meaningful emancipation. They haven't shown that, man.
So even if you want to categorize fluidity and the right to choose your own types of relationships as a norm, isn't it an obviously more open and less oppressive one than this?
Okay, so we just haven't seen that other side. We haven't seen this nebulous idea in which there's some sort of societal norm that is not oppressive. There's some sort of societal norm that, even if it is more fluid, is going to subjugate people who want monogamous relationships. We haven't seen that paradigm. We don't think that it can exist. This is the analysis that Yash and I have brought you. The fact that because we are going to have dominant social norms, we believe that you can meaningfully act within a context of monogamy being dominant. Because there's nothing intrinsic to monogamy specifically that prevents the meaningful emancipation of women. Because to be honest, Madam Chair, it is like monogamous relationships can be incredibly meaningful to people and are incredibly meaningful to people. The fact that you can have beautiful relationships of trust and intimacy and co-mutual validation with people. The fact that you can lead lives which are supportive, both in an economic sense and in other senses. The fact that monogamous relationships don't have to be between an asshole from the deep south and some sort of and a very, very, very oppressed and oppressed woman, right? The fact that monogamous relationships can be between on equal footing two loving gay men, for example. Like, we just don't see the intrinsic damage of monogamy preventing meaningful emancipation when it is dominant in society. You always have dominant societal norms. Nothing about monogamy prevents meaningful emancipation. Proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the MO for speech. Now to invite the government whip to introduce or conclude the case for side government today.
Obviously with
No.
Madam Speaker, the inherent problem with monogamy that OP refuses to believe was ever present in any of the Gov speeches that Vic gives you and spends, I think, a lot of time and a lot of well-used time on in her speech, is that it forces you to group a lot of preferences and a lot of different ways in which you might interact with someone into one individual and all of the problems that accrue with when you have those types of expectations. I think it's a problem that that was the large and overwhelming idea of our extension, and side-second opposition doesn't even pretend to engage with that or even admit to its existence. That's going to be a problem for their whip speaker. I'm sure he'll try to do something about it. Two issues in this debate. First of all, let's talk about what monogamy actually looks like and what a world without it would look like. And second, let's talk about gender autonomy and how this best has impacts. I think that second government wins on both of these and that there was some good stuff throughout the round. I'll talk about it. All right, so first, let's talk about monogamy more realistically. So opposition challenge us to distinguish between the historical and modern contexts of monogamy, right? They basically claim that even if there was all of these historical issues, that it's not fair to wrap those up within modern contexts, and that things could, for instance, get better, and there might once be a better world in which we can look to where this isn't happening. And there's a lot of problems with this line of argumentation coming from both sides of the House. So first of all, I think that it's important that first opposition points out the first government points out the historical context that leads to a lot of things. What Victoria tells you is that this historical context, even if it isn't as same and as bad as it once was, still informs a lot of how these types of interactions and relationships engage with one another, right? So for instance, the expectations that are put on women and put on men are vastly different. Insofar as that is the case, this is an important issue of gender emancipation insofar as women are denied choices that men, frankly, are not denied, right? I think that's important analysis that we get from Victoria on this. But second of all, I think that really one of the biggest problems with side opposition in this debate is that they want to defend an idealistic and completely non-existent version of monogamy that they just invent in their heads in speeches, right? They're like, it could get better, there's nothing inherent about monogamy, without actually ever defending the way that it looks like and the way that it interacts in the real world and actually interacts now. It's absolutely true that many individuals will interact and opt into these types of relationships and will do so to their benefit and to situations in which they actually persevere. But what we tell you on side second government is that insofar as most of these relationships are coercive and have different expectations, that we're better off in a world where that expectation doesn't exist, because more people are actually being put into those situations. I don't think that they can dismiss this by just challenging whether or not this type of reality even actually has that type of impact. But second of all, I think that what we tell you is that a world without monogamy is, for the most part, is one where a vast differentiation of preferences and structures exists. Side first government and side second government tell you that even if it is true that some type of societal norm needs to necessarily replace monogamy, that first of all, fluidity, I don't think, is necessarily a societal norm, as Vic tells you, but even if it is, even if you buy that all of these different types of preferences and interacting in these ways are a different norm, what does second opposition ever tell you in this round to make you believe that that is a worse world, or that those norms are worse for these types of people? They say it has to be replaced by something. It could be bad. But when do they ever give you any reason to believe that those types of situations are worse for people? All of the analysis that Vic gives you, I think, proves quite accurately that this would be better for women and for everyone in general. All right, what else? I'll take front half now and second half.
Full gender emancipation requires empowerment of women and other depiction of media. That's what you're saying. If we make monogamy even more equal, as we see in reality in Sweden, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, why don't you think that it actually can be equal?
So even the most idealistic version of monogamy, I think this is what a lot of the content we get from side second government exists. Even if you have a situation where, for instance, the patriarchal stuff doesn't exist, the types of preferences that happen where you can't, for instance, divorce sexual preference and child rearing, or professionalism and emotional commitment, are necessary and completely unique to monogamy in a way that makes it impossible for that to be beneficial for women. That's important to Vic's speech. I think that's how we interact with that material. All right, so let's get into gender autonomy secondly. Because this debate is important not because, for instance, sexual promiscuity or any type of gender identity is necessarily better than another. That's never been the side position of government. I don't think we've ever argued that on our side of the house. It's been characterized that way, but it's not true. What we tell you is that we need to be able to activate and access these preferences in different sorts of ways. I think this is important for different groups of people, one of which second opposition, unsurprisingly, once again never engages with. Because what Victoria tells you is it's not just as important for women, but also for people that don't fit traditional gender norms, right? So for instance, if I'm in a situation where I'm someone who decides in the middle of a marriage, 5 years into a marriage, that I'm in a situation where I no longer identify myself as a man. If I rely on this person for sexual connection, emotional connection, child rearing, how easy is it going to be for me to access this identity and to change in a meaningful way when I lose all of those things? They don't get that on their side of the house because of the fact that you can't just say, my sexual preference might have changed, or anything else might have changed, right? I think that's one of the problems to monogamy that they didn't access. But the other thing that Victoria tells you here about women and people more generally is that it's important for them to be able to be in a situation where biological constraints don't screw them, right? And I don't understand this as much, for instance, in terms of the science as Vic does, but what I would say is that insofar as we recognize that there are different types of timelines for men and women in terms of being able to have children or being able to access this, it means, as Victoria tells you, that women get into these types of relationships or are forced to get into these types of relationships at an earlier point than men are. Insofar as that is the case, they cannot explore sexually or do many of the things that men have the opportunity to. I don't think it's just a coincidence that you see more situations where men are actively trying to find younger women and older women are not able to do that and are shamed when that sort of thing happens. The reason that that ends up happening is because women aren't considered to be able to be like appealing or like actually like in these types of situations, and that is a shame, Mr. Speaker and Madam Speaker. I apologize for the mix up there. All right. So the last thing that I'd say in terms of this autonomy is that even if it is the case that monogamy in itself might improve, and that you might get into a situation where those types of relationships are the types that side opposition, first and second, would like to see. The problems in terms of allocating preference, the problems in terms of all of the things that we talk about, are never going to disappear from monogamous relationships and are always going to have gender impacts, whether that be on women or whether that be on people who identify in genders on a different type of spectrum. But I think it's also important to recognize that we can't have this debate divorced from reality. Vic points out to you that the reality of monogamy is one that does not look good for women, that has different types of expectations. They cannot simply refute that existence. That is why we are proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the government whip for his speech. I'd now like to invite the opposition whip to conclude the debate for us today.
So the reason we didn't engage directly with the government extension is because it was an extended description of the context of oppression. Indeed, women are oppressed. Indeed, sexuality is an issue. Our contention is that dispelling monogamy creates recurrent social norms, which means you perpetuate gender inequality and don't achieve gender emancipation. The burden upon the government was to show why monogamy is the instrumental barrier to how women can interact within society. We say it isn't. We say it's the nature of society, and our progression is that women work within that society, are emancipated economically so that they have liberal choice in a context of oppression. That is the instrumental step that we think that the government has failed to prove. The link between monogamy and its dominance and the dispelling of it and irreplacement by social forces. So let's look at the process of emancipation. Because we tell you that social norms are going to continue to exist because they are a factor of social interaction. Even in the situation of the ideal fluid environment of choice which they would like to create, people express preferences. Those preferences aggregate when people assert those preferences in a context of being good. So I like having multiple sexual partners. Preference itself, in aggregation as a majority, is oppression, is a social norm. When you say that we're going to dispel social norms by saying monogamy isn't available, all you do is you create the space to dampen the very spectrum of choice. When people will say, I prefer full polygamous relationships, why are you in a 4-person communion? It's the nature of human interaction to make prescriptive claims about what we ought to do, as they did with marriage. And we would say that the ubiquitous nature of this makes the dispelling of monogamy ineffective in changing the dominant social paradigm. It doesn't create the change of how people interact with emancipation. No, thank you. So, even if that wasn't the case, we still think that in a context of social norms, people are able to exercise choice within that. It's because the context of social norms shapes the way in which people can opt in and out. So in marriages, people can get a divorce. People can opt into other social paradigms. It's just that they incur the cost of going against society. That's how society interacts. Majority of people are willing to take up that cost of being the social pariah, in effect to normalize it. It's the situation where that is better achieved not by dispelling one of those social norms, but by giving people greater fluidity to do so. So yes, we should educate women. Yes, we should create a situation where they have economic emancipation in the context of a relationship. It's that situation that we think creates the opportunity for removing oneself from the effect of social norms when we think that they're always going to exist, where they're always going to be coercive forces. No, thank you. So what we would say on that level is we've told you why dispelling monogamy or an attempt to do so doesn't achieve gender emancipation. It's not the instrumental step. It's the context of oppression that women have to work into. The context of oppression that all minorities have to work within. And that's the situation where because of the dominance of a majority in any instance. And we think that even if you try to dispel it, it doesn't change the paradigm that people have to engage with openly.
But what do we tell you about dominance? We said that there are dynamics where the exclusivity creates a negative expectation on the other that does not exist in an order of inclusivity. For example, people who don't drink are just a little bit weird because we have a norm of drinking. If we had a norm of not drinking, then people who did partake would be people who are scumbags or filth or perverted.
Okay, so yes, that assumes that you can create a negative culture, because that is an expression of not preference. People are going to create a preference within that system of negative culture. It always tends towards not, we all embrace not drinking. It's some people embrace drinking, others do not, but that doesn't become the dominant paradigm. It's the nature of preferential choice. Not preferences never create coercive factors. So the second thing we're looking at is like the monogamy is disempowering. So they tell us, even in the context where they tell us that people ought to embrace liberal choice, they tell us that monogamy is inferior. So inherently they tell us that they are prescriptive claims that people make about the nature of relationships themselves. And we think that lends towards our creation of social norms even further. But more than that, they tell us that for bizarre reasons, that you have no fluidity within a marriage. That's a situation that you opt into in the first place by exercising choice, that you're able to opt out of through processes of divorce. And even if it's because of economic dependence, we think that economic dependence and the nature of marriage can be helpful. So you have someone who can support you if you don't feel like your ilk in life is to work. Or you have the situation of single affirmation, where you can form a solid relationship of trust with someone. Even on the paradigm they want to fight that, well, monogamy is always crappy, it's that it never always is, and that is the dominance that we would stand against. Closing.
Insofar as monogamy is of necessity an aggregation of preferences and compromises between things you might not like and things you do like, how is the advocacy of second gut that we present, where a world where you to choose among different types, not a better world?
Thank you, because that's a descriptive claim. You do not achieve that world of fluid choice. Obviously, we should tend towards something as noble as that. That's the obvious outcome that we would like for society. But society and social interactions prevent that. We work within that context. You just described the optimum outcome, never giving us the mechanism as to why dispelling or attempting to achieve that optimal outcome. So we tell you that in that context where you're creating prescriptive claims for people, we would say that system of value is better achieved when social norms continue to exist. So you can create trust and affirmation, you can have interaction, you can have free acceptance of people. And in that paradigm, we think people are able to express preference, are able to go into niche like sexual relationships in the context of the suppression. It's because they just incur the marginal cost. And that's what we think is still acceptable. So what we've heard from the government is not why monogamy is the intrinsic value to how women can interact with society. It's just social norms that are the factor. We say that those never change. And the only way women achieve meaningful emancipation is to work within the context of that social norms. So whether they have greater freedom, they have greater choice, they have greater economic emancipation, those structural changes to how women interact with society are exactly how we achieve gender emancipation in a context of where oppression and patriarchy will likely never go away. It's the dominance of the majority, it's how people interact. And in that context, we think fighting against monogamy, especially when it's subjective, never achieves that. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for the debate. I invite them across the floor to shake hands and go have lunch.
Thank you.